The Lord be with you. A reading from the Holy Gospel according to Mark. Jesus said to the crowds, "This is how it is with the kingdom of God. It is as if a man were to scatter seed on the land and would sleep and rise night and day, and through it all the seed would sprout and grow, he knows not how. Of its own accord, the land yields fruit. First the blade, then the ear, then the full grain in the ear. And when the grain is ripe, he wields the sickle at once, for the harvest has come." Jesus said, "To what shall we compare the kingdom of God? Or what parable can we use for it? It is like a mustard seed, that when it is sown in the ground, is the smallest of all the seeds of the earth. But once it is sown, it springs up and becomes the largest of plants and puts forth large branches, so that the birds of the sky can dwell in its shade." With many such parables, Jesus spoke the word to them as they were able to understand it. Without parables, Jesus did not speak to them, but to his own disciples, he explained everything in private. The Gospel of the Lord.
How do you see the world? How do you encounter it? Imagine that you are placed in one of the classrooms here on campus, and you are accompanied by a mouse, a dog, and a chimpanzee. Now, there'd be 4 animals in that room. It'd be the same physical space, but each of those animals, a mouse, a dog, a chimpanzee, and a human being, encounter that place very differently. What is it for us to encounter the world fully and to encounter ourselves even? Now imagine you put a person who is a believer in God beside someone who doesn't believe in God, and you walk around campus together. How do you encounter the world? I would say very differently. You may encounter the same physical reality, nature, see the crescent moon in the evening after the sun sets. If you saw it last night, it should be there tonight. To see and to smell the basswood trees blooming on campus. You'll drive the same roads, you'll walk the same sidewalks, you'll see the same construction. You may even have the same friends and even the same parents. But you will encounter the world in a very different way. Besides just seeing the natural world, the believer encounters it as creation. It's created by God, that the world you'll see is sacramental. It's not just physical stuff, but it's a sign of the one who creates it. We even see our own life differently. Because of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, we hope for our own resurrection after we have died at the end of time. A person of faith sees the world as permeated by grace. If you went up and squeezed any physical thing, grace would pour out. The believer would encounter not just the world, but the kingdom of God. And what is this kingdom of God of which Jesus Christ speaks in the gospel? He uses 2 different images, though similar. Seeds that grow. The first of a sower who casts seed on the land, and that person sleeps night and day. The seed grows, it germinates, and a stalk comes up, and then fruit is produced, and then those plants are harvested. Then the mustard seed, one of the smallest seeds that will grow to become a very large bush, 6 to 8 feet tall. From this very small beginning, there's a very great conclusion for both of these parables. From seeds to harvest, from seed to a very large bush. And all the while, this growth is being brought about by divine guidance, invisible to the eye, the physical eye. But to the eye of faith, God's guidance is there, giving life, giving growth. The kingdom of God, it's not just a society of people. Perhaps a better word than kingdom of God is the reign of God. The Greek word that we translate as kingdom is basileia. It comes from the Greek word for a king, basileus. So basileia has the sense of a kingship, sovereignty, authority, rule. So perhaps a better way to think about the kingdom of God is God's divine kingship, kingly rule, the power to reign. It's the reign of God, the dominion of God. Just as an aside, the word basilica comes from that word for king, right? A basilica is a royal palace. But this kingdom of God, this God's influence and God's reign is not the work of humankind. It's not something we can bring about by our own power. It is the very work of God. We must open ourselves to God's divine power and influence. We must be like the seed that grows by God's grace. Now, both of these seeds in these parables die. There's a sense of John's gospel here. The seed that dies will produce new life. That seed starts to germinate, sends up a little shoot through the ground into the daylight, starts to photosynthesize, and it grows. We too must die to ourselves, that part of us that wants no place, no part with God. That we can bring forth fruit, new life by the power of God's Spirit. To be permeated and penetrated by the power of God ourselves. There's a 20th century theologian, Maurice Blondel, who writes about this being penetrated by God. He uses the word invasion, the invasion of the human by the divine. He writes, "No one can see God without dying. Nothing can touch God and not be raised up again. For no will is good unless it has come out of itself to leave room for a total invasion by God's will." In Genesis, back in the garden, when we turned away from God, we turned away from His will. We wanted to do what we want to do. We don't want to obey God. We want to rule in His place, not to be subject to anyone, especially God. But God doesn't abandon us to our sinfulness. He sent us His beloved Son into the world. And Jesus Christ reveals to us the presence of one who lives under the reign of God, one whose human will is one with the divine will. Jesus not only proclaims and announces the reign of God, the kingdom of God, but He Himself is the kingdom of God. The messenger is the message Himself. Jesus Himself is the kingdom. Am I ready to be permeated by the will of God, by the will of Christ? Am I ready to live His life? And it means for us to get out of the way, that Christ's life might live in us. Christ is the message. Christ is the kingdom. He Himself, in some sense, is that seed that in His cross and His burial, His death and burial, He enters into the sepulcher, the seed entering the ground. And in His resurrection becomes that mighty bush that draws all the birds of the air to itself. It has branches that spread out. There's a connection between Christ and the church here. That all those branches are the proclaimers of the kingdom. All those birds are all the peoples of the world being drawn into Christ, being drawn to the Father through him. There's an ecclesial, there's a church dimension to these parables. St. Mark is writing to this community, and they, like us, are in this in-between time between the resurrection and Christ's second coming, the parousia. And at every moment, from the smallest part to the totality of what is, from the beginning to the end, everything is permeated by God's grace. It's all under God's reign and influence. The kingdom is here already, but it's not yet come in its fullness. And the church, Christ's church, is a sign, a visible sign, a sacrament of that kingdom, of the power of God, what it can do to bring forth holiness, justice, and peace. The word for the church, ecclesia, means to be called out from darkness, from sin, from death, and to be called into the kingdom of light, of grace, of life, and love. To have that Spirit breathed into us, to make of us a new life, to make us a new green plant, full of life. The parables today, like the first reading of God taking the top of this cedar tree, this majestic cedar tree, and bringing back the Jewish exiles from Babylon in the 6th century BC, and restoring them, planting them back in the Holy Land. And all the birds of the air will fill those branches. It's the Jews being given a new home, being given their old home anew. I think it's also a sign of the fullness of the kingdom, that all nations are to be drawn to God. Jews first, but Gentiles second. All of us are called into that kingdom, called to encounter Christ, called to live in his life. We too begin our lives as a very tiny being, one-celled zygote that will grow. And what is the fullness of our life? To reach the height of personhood, adulthood, to encounter Christ and to become a new creation. Who are we becoming under his reign and under his influence? Parables today call us to encounter Christ, call us to become a part of his church, to be a sign of the kingdom of God, to have that fullness of life. We too are growing under the influence of God. Do we resist it? Or do we open ourselves more and more to it, to die to this sinful part of ourselves, to get out of the way, that Christ can live in us, that we can bring the harvest of our lives, all that we have done, when we reach the end of our days? There's a harvest of our life that will take place. The gospel parable is about the harvest of all at the end of time. May we joyfully live out our baptismal life, living each day, putting on this white garment to grow in holiness, to grow in love, and to be this great sign of the kingdom of God, that God's reign and influence is there. How do we encounter the world? How do we see it? Do we have the eyes of faith to see the kingdom all around us and to enter into it fully?